Hi, Timberwolves. Miss Rubelino coming in with another virtual lesson going over Reconstruction and taking a moment to break things down for you after the Civil War. So let's go ahead and as we get things started, think about how the Civil War ended. We're starting to see that the Confederates are losing, and eventually Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, happening on April 9th of 1865. So a couple of things I just want to mention to you about the Civil War. With all the advantages the Union had, they did feel that they were going to win at a quicker pace than that 4-year battle as it was going on. So when they were going through and seeing all these different things going on, especially looking at battles like Antietam, they just could not believe that that was happening. So it was then that Abraham Lincoln comes around and he sees, oh my goodness, this war is going to be longer than it needs to be, and he's trying his best to go ahead and win. And as this war continues to go on, and eventually the Union wins, the destruction and the total war meaning that the all means necessary to win the war. So destruction or anything like that is happening. Buildings are being torn down, burnt, plantations are being completely ruined to go ahead and win this war. And it really leads to a whole lot of resentment at the end. So at this time with the Reconstruction, you want to remember that President Lincoln wants to do things a little differently, remembering that the South is his people, and he wants to go ahead and bring the nation back together as peaceful as possible. As he said, malice toward none, charity to all. So again, you need to remember that this sectionalism that leads to part of the Civil War, along with the failed compromises and the complete difference of each section of the United States, now has to come together. And how do they do that? Sadly, 5 days after the end of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is killed, and he is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth 5 days after. So on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln dies after being assassinated at the theater, and John Wilkes Booth escaping and then eventually being found and killed. So the idea of this, all this happening at once, just goes to show you that Reconstruction, the Reconstruction era, is really starting to be very, very tough. The Civil War is fighting from 1861 to 1865, and the Reconstruction period starts from 1865 to 1874. And how it's set up and who's involved and what's happening is really what sets the tone to how the South was. So let's go ahead and let's just break things down and make things a little bit easier for you as we go through Reconstruction. Feel free to take a few notes or take a look at the work that we've been going through in class, but hopefully this will take care of any of ambiguous ideas. So this right here just goes to show you where all the battles were fought inside of the United States, kind of taking a look, and you can see a large amount over here in Maryland. Okay, so as Maryland is where you're going to be closer to the capital, a lot of battles are happening there. And then you could see Texas is all the way over here, and you have very few battles. You have altogether, I believe, 1, 2, 3, so the Sabine Pass, the 2 battles of Galveston and Palmito Ranch. So Texas was really not hurt, but they were definitely relied on to keep the war going. But taking a look at where this is happening, think about all the destruction that is going on in the South. Whereas all right here, even at these areas, this is all considered Southern territory that seceded, and these here are slave states, but also they are part of the Union. They didn't want to leave. So all this destruction is happening here. So you could imagine the effects Reconstruction had. So take a look at a few of these pictures that were taken after Reconstruction with the bringing of, you know, the photograph. You could see buildings are completely torn down. You can see that it is absolutely destroyed. Now think about this, the South lost, so now they have to pay for this, and where is the money going to come from? So again, being able to rebuild this and try and bring your economy back is almost nearly difficult because your economy is based off slavery, and now slavery is illegal. So how are they going to be, well, it's just abolished. So how do we go ahead and we work with that now? So these are the challenges that the South has to be able to do to come back into the Union. The war is over, they just can't come back. There has to be repercussions, there has to be regulations, there has to be a list of things that they have to be able to complete to come back in. And we're going to investigate all that here. So as we continue on, we're starting to see that the South is having issues, problems with southern states. Okay, we see many of the Confederate states lay in ruins, as you can see from the pictures from the previous slide. Okay, money was not available at the time because, you know, a lot of the money was used to go ahead and work with that war. The economy is completely broken down. Slaves are eventually free and they're dealing with problems of their own. You need to remember, slaves were cared for by their masters, given food, shelter, and now that they're free, their masters are not obligated to go ahead and take care of them. Not saying that they were taken care of well while slaves, but now they are out and they have to buy food, but they don't have money. They need to find shelter, but they don't know where to go. The Southerners aren't going to be giving that Southern hospitality to them. So there is definitely, again, bitterness between the North and the South, that whole idea of sectionalism coming in, the North wanting to change the South and create different ways that they're not used to. So this is going to leave things to be very bittersweet between the North and the South. You could already imagine the different types of challenges that they are going to have to come by. And in the end, slaves are the once enslaved people who are now the freed men are dealing with the short end of the stick, trying to go ahead and find their place within this new country that they now are free in. So as we continue, let's take a moment and think about Texas. Texas, as we showed before, had no major battles, which means there was very little destruction in Texas. Looking at Galveston, where the battles were, mostly were naval battles. Palmito Ranch, which really wasn't considered a major battle. It was just more like a little scrimmage between the Confederates and the Union soldiers. So the war left Texas in a lot of debt because they had to supply a lot of the material, food, or whatever they could to keep the Confederacy going. So they were in debt with that. Many former Confederates hated the Northerners because of what they left their state in complete shambles. Slaves are obviously set free, which means the plantation system has fell apart, which means the Southern cotton is king. Plantations has fallen, and now they have nothing else to fall back on. So this is kind of where the devastation takes place. Now, in places like Georgia, Maryland, Virginia, those are where a lot of the battles were fought, and their economies are ruined, but now they have to dealing with all of the ramifications of the war, the destruction, and how is that going to get paid? It really leaves them in complete debt for a long time. So as we start to see, problems in Texas are just going to be very simple. You have the economy based on plantation system. It's no longer there. So cotton is far less profitable now because they don't have the slave labor to be able to produce these large amounts of the product that they need. The government obviously collapsed. So new Confederate leaders fled to Mexico for fear of being, put on trial and then possibly dealing with death. Society inside of Texas, we're looking at many Texans in the war died. So there's a large population loss. Many men, a lot of women left to kind of deal with this. Farms and plantations are left vacant. Freed slaves are uncertain of what they need to do. And again, that resentment towards the North, looking at the scallywags and the carpetbaggers. If you remember, scallywags are people inside the South who are for, Republican change, whereas they are not viewed very well. And you could just imagine the target on their back for wanting this change, almost feeling like traitors to the South.
Ashley
Gibson, one second.
In the front, picking you up. Ashley Gibson, you're right in the front.
So sorry about that interruption. So as we start to see that society at this time, many people are just trying to go ahead and build up the South. And we start to see that it is poorly put together and that it just leaves for a lot of uncertainty for the freed people, for the Confederates, and just a lot of resentment towards the North. So as we continue, just a few things to kind of think about with changing government. Lincoln has now been assassinated, and that means his predecessor, Vice President Andrew Johnson, takes over. And if you take a moment and you think, Andrew Johnson has some big shoes to fill, and he wants to go ahead and continue with Lincoln's idea of trying to bring in the South with little resentment or just have kindness. So as we start to see, Johnson comes in as the 17th US president, and he is responsible for the Reconstruction period. You can imagine the stress that this put on him. So he sets up this provisional government in the Confederate States, and he appoints new government officials and ordered federal troops to protect them, because you could imagine, I'm sure they were not welcomed with open arms in the South. So these provisional governments would govern these states until they were admitted into the Union. So what that basically means is, to come back into the Union, they had to agree to these set of rules and change their state constitutions to be able to come back. And we're going to go over kind of what that is. So the rules to be able to come back into the Union were very simple. Each state had and required to nullify its act of secession, which means they said they take it back. They cancel that idea of secession. They then, each state had to write a new state constitution that involved these particular things. They had to go ahead and abolish slavery. Okay, each state had to acknowledge that the US government would not pay its Civil War debts, which means that they were responsible to go ahead and deal with their own destruction. And if you remember back to those pictures, taking a look right here, the government is not going to help them. They're responsible to pay for this. So you could imagine, my goodness, how much did that cost? Texas at least was lucky with little destruction on that part. We then begin to see that each state had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which meant that slavery is abolished. But remember back at the Dred Scott decision, where it basically said that African Americans are not US citizens, and they cannot go ahead and exercise the rights of US citizens in the United States, being able to have legal representation, being able to vote, being able to have free education, if those educations were implemented in those states. So you can imagine, they're free, but now they have very little job experience, no skills, they are illiterate, and they have no way to be able to survive. So being free wasn't really all what it cut out to be. So how do we move forward and see that we help these new freed people into society? And that's where Reconstruction comes in. So Reconstruction in Texas does begin, and just a few things to kind of think about. So in 1865, these generals went into different areas of the South, and they went ahead and they put forth Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which basically said all slavery is illegal, okay, and it is abolished. So the proclamation was to declare that idea of slaves are free. This caused much celebration for those that were abolitionists who supported anti-slavery. And we take a look at the idea that slaves were also now freed people, and they were also very happy about this. So at the end of slavery, we start to see that there still was a lot of stuff to do. Where do they work? Where do they go? So the general at the time, the only idea he could think of is continue to work on the plantations you were. But instead of working as a slave, you need to get paid for this. So this is kind of what we start to see as the only skills that they have, because we didn't have anything, or we mean the United States didn't have anything implemented for these new freed men to do. So obviously not very organized. As we continue on, we see that there's a lot of help for these freed men. So the Freedmen's Bureau is created, and it's basically set up by the US Congress to provide aid for the new freed African Americans in the South. So they would help them find jobs, issue food and clothing. They would give them opportunities to learn, be able to go ahead and understand how and what is available to them, being able to be citizens among. They also provided schools to educate them and find them skills to be able to find jobs. These schools were the first public schools in Texas specifically, and for African Americans. So by 1870, Texas had more than 100 schools for African Americans. The Freedmen Bureaus also helped African Americans register to vote. And that was very important, because we need to remember the population in the South. We see that the white Southerners now are now a minority, where now these new freed people, these new freed men are now the majority because they have large numbers. And that is very scary for the white Southerners because now they don't have control, but they do try to implement ways to be able to limit the power that the new freedman has. And we're going to be investigating that today. So Texas being able to come into the United States submits a brand new constitution. They actually just add a few things there, and they basically say, okay, we're going to go ahead and here's our constitution. And they said they nullified the secession and abolished slavery. Okay. However, they did not grant African Americans equal rights. They put forth these ideas of black codes where they were barred from voting, they couldn't hold public office, and they were not allowed to serve on juries for any white man that was being put on trial. It did grant them opportunity to own property, but if you think about it, without these other rights, how are you going to be able to afford property if you can't even have a job and you're not really educated? So these are the types of things that I want you to think about. Wonderful. You could own land, but you're not given the opportunity for success. They're just set up for failure, so they cannot move forward. So Texas really didn't do a great job, but they are not let back into the Union at this time. So if we take a look at the radical Republicans, so after Johnson comes through and he's trying to implement this the best way he can, he gets taken over by the radical Republicans in Congress by a vote. So leaders in Congress felt that Johnson and Lincoln's ideas were way too nice, and they wanted to see vengeance in the South, and they wanted things to change drastically. And you need to remember, these radical Republicans sent and create more resentment towards the North and making it almost nearly impossible for improvements to happen. So as we start to see the result of Johnson's, codes, which allow black codes to be created, Jim Crow laws, lack of voting. The Reconstruction plan was thought as way too easy on the South. The radical Republicans wanted tougher requirements on Southern states so that this way they had to follow these laws to a T. And if they didn't, they would not be able to go ahead and get what aid they needed or to be let back into the United States. President Johnson was not trying to let them take over, but unfortunately, due to his lack of popularity at the time, he lost and the radical Republicans take over, and this gave them full power to override and veto whatever Johnson wanted to do. And that is what leads to the radical plan, the radical Republican plan taking over. So remember, Lincoln wants to go ahead and create things easy and a nice transition back into the Union. Johnson tries to continue with that and sets forth these rules that they have to follow. They have to go ahead and nullify the secession. They have to be able to abolish slavery, and they're responsible for their own debts. That's basically all he requires. The radical Republicans, remember, are like, that's way too easy. They need more restrictions. And so what the radical Republicans do is they create these 5 military districts inside. You can see right here, you have Virginia being 1, the Carolinas being 2, Alabama all the way down to Florida being 3, Mississippi and Arkansas 4, Louisiana and Texas 5. These are these 5 military districts. And from there, they're able to go ahead and implement these really strong, strict military rules, which you can imagine is not very comfortable for the Southerners, who again create this resentment. So just to kind of take a look at what the radical Republicans do, they go ahead and their plan is able to declare the Southern governments illegal, that they are not allowed to go. They divide it into 5 military districts, as I showed you in the map before, and they are in no control of that particular region. Texas and Louisiana were the 5th district, and they were controlled by Philip Sheridan. Southern states had to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendment, which means they had to accept it into their constitution, and that was forced on them. So the 14th Amendment, if you remember, gives African American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gives them the right to vote. States had to write new constitutions, and they had to repeal all their black codes that they implemented to go ahead and make things very unfair and unconstitutional for the new Black communities. So Congress made white Southerners take ironclad oaths, which basically said that they will not go against the South, and they had to go ahead and have voluntary service in the Army of the Confederacy or helped in any way. The oath basically said that they had not voluntarily served in the Army of the Confederacy or helped in any way. The oath will keep most white Southerners from voting, serving in juries, or holding public office. Because again, many of them were fighting. So these ironclad oaths were basically meant for those that didn't fight. So many of them weren't able. So you see how strict that is, and that kind of creates that resentment towards the North. Now we see that African Americans at this time now have their citizenship and their right to vote, and they try and exercise this right to vote. However, what we start to see is that they are being stopped by organizations that are being created, like the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was founded in Tennessee in 1866, and it had spread to Texas. The Klan used terror and violence in an attempt to block Reconstruction efforts and prevent Blacks from voting. Because you need to remember, they have the higher population and they are majority, and they can make huge changes. A lot of Southerners who were against, legislation being available to the new Black community, they didn't want that. They didn't want to see them as mayors. They didn't want to see them as governors. They didn't want to see them helping make laws. Okay, so they also disliked, the KKK also disliked those carpetbaggers, people that are coming from the North and coming to the South to help rebuild and spreading Freeman Bureau's ideas. They also didn't like scallywags, which were Southerners who supported Reconstruction. So again, their list was very long of who they did not like. Okay, so most Klan violence included beatings, shootings, murders in homes and schools, and crops were burned. So you can see that these are definitely very difficult to kind of deal with. So kind of think about how hard that is. Okay, so now we start to see that Texas now, with these radical Republicans, have to go ahead and change their constitution to be let back in to the United States. So these new changes include no one could be prevented from voting. So that again is the 15th Amendment. It allowed Blacks to hold public office and increased funding for public schools, which is where African Americans were going. Increased the Texas governor's power. And after the Constitution was created, 11 were elected to the Texas state legislature. Okay, so this is kind of where Texas comes in and how it's being affected by them. So they create this Constitution in 1866. And what we start to see is that one is not really taken. And then they create this one in 1869, which adopts the 14th and 15th Amendments. Okay, so as we continue on, we begin to see that these amendments to the US in the Reconstitution help change the way the US is rebuilding in the South. It allows and abolishes slavery. So Reconstruction brings forth these 3 amendments. Make sure you know them. The 13th Amendment, which was given at the end of the Civil War, which abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, which comes in 1868, which guaranteed citizenship and equal rights to Blacks. And then we begin to see the 15th Amendment in 1870 comes in and gave suffrage and voting rights to just Black men. At this time, women, whether it be white or Black women, were not allowed to vote yet. That doesn't come until 1919 with the 19th Amendment. So here we go. Here's we see all these changes in the Reconstruction period, and we see the highs and the lows, and we see kind of how it's forming and how these different plans were helping and what they allowed to institute and create. So free citizens vote, thinking about it, your three different amendments. Okay, 13th, free, 14th, citizen, 15th, voting. Hopefully that helps you. So this concludes the Reconstruction inside of Texas history. As you go back and you go through, remember about the Reconstruction plans with the radical Republicans, how things were set up and what was needed. If you have any questions, go and see your teacher and hopefully they'll take care of it. If not, take care, Timberwolves. Have a good one.